Favorite little cartoons clipped from an old New Yorker magazine. The title over the 3 blocks below was Upcoming Vatican Announcements. And these 3 squares included conclusions that were made in the future by the Vatican. In the first block, which was dated 5667 AD, a cleric is studying an evolutionary chart and declares, it can be admitted, Darwin's theory of evolution was pretty much on the money. In a block dated 6334 AD, with the Vatican standing in the midst of a teeming mass of humanity, the announcement was, perhaps birth control is not such a terrible idea after all. And finally, in the block that's dated 3419, you see the back of a man with a jeweled mitre sitting on his head, gazing at a chart of the universe, declaring, Galileo was right. The Earth does revolve around the sun. The cartoon derives its humor, of course, from the historic reluctance of the institutional church, not only the Roman Catholic Church, to accommodate obvious and clear discoveries within the scientific community into religious belief systems. But for me, the cartoon derives a kind of spiritual meaning in that realization that the very deepest truths about life and meaning and value and purpose, that these all are in a constant process of revelation. They're constantly being revealed. And that try as we may, what we have learned and has been entered into the realm of knowledge can't be unlearned. What has finally somehow become known cannot become unknown. For the better part of some 500 years or so, the general attitude in the world between institutional religion and science has been one of a kind of antagonism and distrust. There's something about what the, quote, other side represents that is seen as a kind of threat. Theologians and clerics demeaned and denounced all kinds of efforts by the scientific community to understand the true basis of creation, even if it didn't sort of replicate scriptural precedent. And scientists dismissed everyone who was a person of faith as somehow kind of being a naive fool of sorts, content to live in what they saw as a make-believe world. So lest we start to operate under the assumption that all this is just some ancient relic of pre-Enlightenment Europe, this controversy, this struggle that goes back and forth between people, to sort of point out how that is not a gone-by era of how we relate in this world. I would just refer you to some news that I saw last week that said in Florida they are developing a new social studies curriculum which is going to include, as one of the founding fathers of America, Moses. That seems a stretch. Nevertheless, To my way of thinking, that kind of antagonism that goes on between science and religion isn't actually the worst of it. What seems a more profound obstacle to the health and well-being of this planet and the life that has emerged on it is that reality that science and religion have become so dismissive of each other, convinced somehow that the other has nothing at all of value to share. When I talk about this divide, I know that I'm not necessarily talking about a divide that exists in this room. If you had a choir, I'd be preaching to it. Yeah, okay, good. I'm trying out new material, so it's always, helpful to know you're there. I'm sure every UU congregation that we would be a part of would have a number of people in its midst who have scientific training or who work in technical scientific fields, who, in spite of their grasp of all the facts and realities of science, still find themselves engaged in a primary and deep religious quest for meaning. A hallmark of our UU tradition is our sense of, I think, what I call a kind of sense of hospitality, to be a place where reason and science can be used to discern truth in this world, but not at the exclusion of other forms of knowing. So here, most of the time, we don't find a great conflict between the scientific method and the spiritual life. But try as we may, a distinct, though noisy minority as we are amongst religious people when it comes to trying to infuse the sacred with a sense of the scientific, and the scientific with a sense of the sacred. I should probably say that we're not, of course, the only religious people who seek to expand the boundaries of traditional theology. There have been people like Matthew Fox within the Catholic Church who have incorporated scientific insight and wonder into theology, even if they're not particularly welcomed in their own tradition. They continue to study and write and influence the religious world. And as a religious movement, this kind of, for ourselves, this reintegration, I think, of the sacred and the scientific, this actually might be one of the most important challenges that exists for religion in the era we live in, this need to bring these two together. And I think it's actually more than just a challenge. I think for Unitarian Universalists, it almost is a sacred obligation of ours, if you may. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments, but simply it points out the reality of our world and the dangers that it's in and the dangers that continue if these two important voices don't somehow speak to each other. The scientific revolution of the 17th century had its roots, I suppose, in religious doctrine of the very earliest church. The early church theologians, relying largely on Aristotle, looked at the universe and saw it as a very tidy, earth-centered universe. And because in their Enlightenment thinking, their sense of the divine, their sense of God was rational and intentional about creation, that meant that the universe would also be rational and consistent. But at the same time, they were aware that a universe that was created out of nothing, as of course Genesis describes, that could have turned out a lot differently than it did. But somehow they understood this was what God determined. This is what God created, by laws that were not necessarily discernible to human thought. And the only way they thought that you could determine the guiding laws of the universe of God were through experimentation and observation. So here's where the Enlightenment thinking kind of came into the world of science and turned it around. And with that, the scientific revolution began. And all went well, of course, until observation and experiment started to reveal a universe in which human beings gradually became to reach a point where they felt less and less at home. This comforting world where we were all an earth and we as humans were at the center, suddenly when we're not at the center, that shook up the whole world. that the existential impact of the scientific revolution sometimes is a little hard for some of us to get our minds around today as we think about it. We see every day online, in the newspaper, on television, stories about the way science has just become an integrated part of our whole lives. Whether it's studies of the human genome, or the discovery of a new species of life, or simply looking and hearing about, all of a sudden his name's just gone from me, that wonderful astronomer who, Neil Tyson, help me out? Neil deGrasse Tyson, yeah, I knew I've just watched all those. So sort of our encounter with that, and it's just made this almost a daily part of our life. So it doesn't penetrate so deeply into us, that sense of displacement in the world. And though we may still act like it, we know better than to think that the world was created solely for our benefit, or that humans were made to have dominion over other creatures, or that we are the center, spatially or morally, of the universe. Yet in the scope of human history, which is of course just such a blink of time, when you think of all time, in that time we have lived with a kind of confident and assured place of honor and privilege. We've acted as if we were at the center of that creative universe. People like Copernicus and Galileo and Darwin did nothing less than, in some ways, evict us from that cozy home that everyone was imagining for themselves. So, from being the ultimate reason for creation, we became, through the scientific revolution, really not that much more than a finite fluke in a cosmos that existed before us and that will exist beyond us. Talk about a blow to the ego. But not only that, what a public relations nightmare for the church that had placed all of its bets on being a more familiar and friendly place where God was the landlord of the universe. By all rights, science ought to have perhaps replaced religion by now. Science, in a lot of ways, has proved itself superior to any traditional theology that I know about at explaining the actual mechanics of the world. As we all know, science is actually fearless when it comes to being challenged. Not so much with religion. Scientific practice, unlike theological reflection, tries sometimes as hard as it can to prove that a theory is false, as it tries to prove that it's true. Science and its related discoveries have infiltrated every corner of our daily lives, from the computers that we work on to the cell phones we carry everywhere in our pockets, to the medical experiments and treatments that keep us alive longer. But of course, for all of those strengths, science has not replaced religion. And I think there's one very good reason for that, and that's because science doesn't amount to, well, it just doesn't amount to much of a religion. Science can't be beat if you want to know how something works, how it works. But of course it makes no claims at all to engaging the questions that are human questions that probably live in every single one of us that's here, and largely is why we're here. But it makes no claims to engaging those questions of meaning and of ethical choices, of simply the mystery that the world's religions have all paused and thought of since the beginning of consciousness. Science, by its very nature, makes no claims on any final truths. They are all acknowledged to be theoretical, tentative, partial, yet to be fully completed. So it doesn't require any particular trust or faith on our part. Each fact and each building block has a way of being proven. In lots of ways, science isn't interested in problems on the human scale of life. It's not built on a hierarchy of value as religion can often be. It functions without a need or a place for adoration or worship, celebration or praise. It gives us facts. But beyond all of that, I think that the main reason that science has not and never will replace some form of what we all know of and think of as quote-unquote religion, it's because science isn't equipped, and I should say it's not intended to engage all that remains a mystery about us. Of course, science over time has shed all kinds of light in dimensions of the universe that have once seemed to us to be too complex for human beings to grasp. And over time, more and more of the sort of unknown dark corners of the universe have been illuminated and come to be known to us. But what science is equipped to overcome is actually sort of human ignorance. It isn't equipped to overcome mystery. The genuine mysteries of existence, science will remain silent on. The mysteries like the pain of grief, or the astounding joy that comes with love. The very nature of the soul, the source of wisdom, the human impulse toward being generous and compassionate to others, the meaning of suffering, the presence of the holy around us, the ambiguity of moral choice, the very purpose of our being here in time and place together. Those questions religion is equipped to engage in a way that science is simply not intended to. At the risk of oversimplifying, I guess, what is a lot of the time a subject of mind-boggling complexity, it seems important that I should bring the sermon here into focus around some of those very elemental, basic substances that pulse in the core of both scientific and religious enterprises, because I see them definitely as connected. What we're talking about here is the relationship between, at least for my way of thinking, between knowledge and mystery. They're not intended to be paired as opposites, sort of in a struggle for supremacy. They're intended to be paired, in my understanding, as something that are complementary forces, complementary strategies, complementary paths that are interdependent, as so much of this world is as we've come to know it. Interdependent but related concepts for making ourselves again feel at home in the universe, at home in this world we share. One of my favorite writers is a man named Chet Ramo, who writes science and nature pieces. I'm not sure. He teaches at Stonehill College in Massachusetts. And one of his books is called Honey from Stone. And in that, he shared a metaphor that is something that's just stuck with me for years and years. I probably first read it 20 years ago. And this sermon seemed a place for it to find life again. And this is what Chet Ramo wrote. He said this: "Let this then be the ground of my faith. All that we know, now and forever, all scientific knowledge that we have in this world, or that we will ever have, is an island in the sea of mystery." Knowledge is an island in the sea of mystery. We live, he continues to say, we live in our partial knowledge as the Dutch live on polders claimed from the sea. We dike and fill. We dredge up the soil from the bed of mystery and build ourselves room to grow. And still the mystery surrounds us. It is always lapping at our shores. It permeates the land. Scratch the surface of knowledge, and mystery bubbles up like a spring. And occasionally, at certain disquieting moments in history, Galileo, Planck, Einstein, a tempest of mystery comes rolling in from the sea and overwhelms our efforts, reclaims knowledge that has been built up by years of patient work, and forces us to retreat to the surest, most secure core of what we know. And there we huddle in fear and trembling until the storm subsides. And then we start building again, throwing up the dikes, pumping, filling, extending the perimeter of our knowledge and security in this great sea of mystery. I love that. Should we take this metaphor of knowledge being an island in the sea of mystery, should we take that just a step further and relate it to the relationship of science to religion, of knowledge to mystery? Ramo points out that while science enlarges always the size of the island, extending the shore of the island of knowledge, it never quite depletes the mystery, which is the powerful thing. It never depletes the mystery. So it's along the shore of this relationship of knowledge and mystery where, to use our phrase of the month, our theme of the month, it's in that place where those two places meet that revelation emerges. The creative work of both the mind and the spirit are accomplished on that ground, where the hard facts of science are fluid and mingle somehow, where knowledge and wonder even overlap. I sometimes put it in my own personal life, and I'm sure you've all had this kind of wonderful moment where you walk along a long stretch of beach, hopefully in the summer, in bare feet, and you walk right along the cusp with one foot splashing in the water and the other on the sand, walking that narrow margin. I think of that when I think of Ramo's metaphor. Critics at both ends of the political spectrum, I suppose, have had criticism of the ascendancy of science and blamed it oftentimes on the woes that we've gotten ourselves in the world. The more conservative among us sometimes blame science for transgressing bounds of moral and ethical principles, for trying to play God, as it were. And sometimes the more liberal critics blame science and progress for a diminished sense of the sacred, for callousness toward the environment, for an egocentric kind of relationship to nature. And there's truth, perhaps, in all of those claims. A better answer, for me at least, is found in our collective history. When I think about this, when nearly 400 years ago, the Church adopted and opted for what actually was a defunct cosmology. Imagine what would have happened if 400 years ago the Church had embraced Galileo at his trial for his understanding of the cosmos and found ways to infuse that understanding with a kind of sacred meaning. I suppose if they had done that, we would all be sitting in a Catholic church today. But it didn't. And as a result, the faithful, quote unquote, as I put it, have been expected to live simultaneously in two radically contradictory worlds, bouncing back and forth between the worlds of the 1st and the 21st centuries. To my way of thinking, at least, our diminished sense of the sacred has a lot less to do with the ascendancy of science than with the failure of traditional religion to incorporate what is simply astounding and wonderful about scientific knowledge into a more accessible framework of spirituality and worship. This is where I think we Unitarian Universalists are in the best position to embrace all who have found a way to walk along that shoreline of knowledge and mystery, and to introduce them to the transformative space and community that we create together, letting people know that there is a place where those risks can be taken with deep reward. I should say I'm not deluded by any grandiose illusions that our religious movement, at this moment at least, is adequately equipped to the present time to rescue the world with some unique form of enlightened spiritual wisdom. As a movement, we are often easily distracted and diverted from some of our most profound strengths as a responsive, evolving, organic synthesis of ancient truth and contemporary knowledge and the holy mysteries that come from existence. But I am convinced, and hopeful even, that we have a special opportunity at this moment in time to make a difference to the future of the planet and the people who live on it. Many things about Unitarian Universalists are just as conventional as any other religious movement. But in fact, we are different. We represent a radical spiritual tradition that could profoundly transform the contours of the religious landscape beyond the limited sphere of influence that we often have right now. And so there are ways that I think our most important legacy as a religious movement could be to transforming the larger religious conversation around science and religion in a way to heal the world's soul. We offer, I think, a ecological, theological model that emphasizes the interrelatedness of every part of this amazing creation. We do trust that science could be the basis for religious experience, that science can bring us astonishment, adoration even, maybe praise. We affirm in this great, vast vision a unity that is the most common theme to creation, and stand in awe of our little tiny place in it. Satisfied, at least I am, by the sufficiency of this accident, this accidental miracle even, of being able to be who we are, where we are on this speck of cosmic dust that's planet Earth. And in this place we worship and celebrate and wonder. Annie Dillard once wrote something about human life on Earth, which is part of how I will close. It's probably familiar to many of you. She said this: "We are here to abet creation and to witness to it, to notice each other's beautiful face and complex nature, so that creation need not play to an empty house." Well, it's a nice poetic idea, this notion of creation desiring an audience to its vast spectacle. I'll admit that is something of a human projection of needs and wishes, when in fact it's actually entirely up to us. Creation can play to an empty house. Once upon a time, of course, before anything resembling a human appeared on the scene, it was doing just fine without us. But just the same, I'd hate to think of all we'd miss if we weren't here.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.